Hello Year 9, here is lesson 10 of an Inspector Calls. So we are going to retrieve the word patriarchal and the word scandal today, and misogyny is our new word, although some of you may be familiar with misogyny already. So what evidence have we so far that Sheila is affected by patriarchy? So try and remember what we mean by a patriarchal society. And what evidence do we have so far that Sheila is affected by patriarchy? So you can pause the video now and answer that question, or you can wait and listen to me define patriarchy for you in case you've forgotten. So a patriarchal society is a male-dominated society, okay? And with all of the literature texts that we'll be studying for your GCSE, they are all patriarchal societies. And you could argue, some would, some wouldn't, that we live in a patriarchal society even today. But that is most definitely a debate for another time. So what evidence do we have so far that Sheila is affected by patriarchy? So think about any times when someone has talked down to Sheila or treated her maybe like a child, or treated her like her opinions don't really matter. So last lesson we looked at scandal. What does it reveal about Mr Birling that he is worried about a scandal? Now remember, a scandal is something coming out publicly that you're ashamed of or would affect your reputation. So what does it reveal about Mr Birling that he is worried about a scandal? So you can pause the video and answer those two questions. And then finally we have misogyny. Now misogyny is the dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. So anytime somebody talks down to women, makes sexist remarks about women, that is misogyny. This idea that women are somehow less than men, that is misogyny. And unfortunately, misogyny is not something that we don't have to put up with as women in today's society. And it is a really important concept, an important word for us to know and recognise in others. So how could Eva Smith be viewed as a victim of misogyny then? Think about the misogyny that she may have suffered so far from what we've understood about her life. So you can pause the video and ensure that you've given yourself a chance to answer those three questions independently before I give you the answers. So what evidence do we have so far that Sheila is affected by patriarchy? Well, we know that Sheila very much behaves herself like a child. You wouldn't think from the way she speaks and behaves that she is a mature adult. And a lot of that will be because of the way she has been brought up and the expectations on her as a rich girl. She isn't really supposed to have her own opinions. She isn't really supposed to be that intelligent to be able to challenge the opinions of a man. She very much knows her place in society, which is basically to marry well, be a good wife, and make her husband look good, and then eventually give him children, ideally sons. So Sheila's affected by patriarchy because it has defined her whole life. Sheila may come across as very privileged, and she is. She's far more privileged than someone like Eva Smith, but she is still a victim. Here, she is still a victim of patriarchy. She is still a victim of misogyny, as every woman was at the time. Now, what's interesting, and when we are in school and when we go over this play in more detail next year, when we are amazingly back in the classroom together, we will talk a lot more about these ideas of patriarchy and misogyny, because remember, J.B. Priestley was an advocate for women's rights. So he supported the rights of women. So Sheila is a victim of patriarchy, although being rich, she isn't as negatively affected as someone like Eva Smith. So what does it reveal about Mr Birling that he is worried about a scandal? We know all Mr Birling cares about is his reputation, and he wants to climb the social ladder. And if there's a scandal, then that could negatively affect his position in society, and we know that he doesn't care about anyone else. He is an individualist, he is a capitalist. We know that he has this every man for himself attitude, and a scandal would affect his reputation, which would affect his status. So finally, how could Eva Smith be viewed as a victim of misogyny? Well, Eva Smith is totally powerless. Totally powerless. Not only is she poor, she is a poor woman. So when Mr Birling fires her and says she had far too much to say and, you know, I had to let her go, he didn't like the idea of a woman, let alone a poor woman, talking back to him and sticking up for herself. So, you know, it wasn't just the fact that she's poor that people look down on her. It's also the fact that she is a woman as well. And Eva Smith does not have the protections of society that Sheila does. She is by herself, and because she's poor, she's seen as expendable, and people can treat her however they want, and it simply doesn't matter because her life is not as important. And remember, this attitude to the poor is what Priestley is trying to change. We should look at the way Eva Smith is treated as an audience and think this is really, really wrong. So today we are going to have our first of two lessons looking at Sheila's character and what Sheila did to Eva Smith. So we're going to explain how Priestley uses language to develop our impression of Sheila. So we're going to think about how Priestley uses language to develop your impression of Sheila's character, how this impression links to Priestley's beliefs and his intentions. Remember, he believes in socialism, he believes in social equality, he wants to get rid of the class system, he wants the rich to accept that they have a responsibility towards the poor, and he also wants to promote the rights of women. How does his representation of Sheila on the stage link into all of those things? And we're also going to think about how she's a victim of misogyny. So we are going to read the next section of the play, and what I want you to be thinking about and what we're going to pick out: how does Sheila's attitude appear to differ from her father's attitude? And how could you view Sheila as a victim of misogyny here? So as I attempt to get the radio player up, what I want you to think about equally is how does her attitude differ from Mr Birling's, but equally how is she presented as a victim of misogyny?
What's this about streets? Oh, sorry, I didn't know we had a visitor. Mummy sent me to ask why you didn't come along to the drawing room.
We shall be along in a minute now. Just finishing.
I'm afraid not.
There's nothing else, you know.
What's this about?
Nothing to do with you, Sheila. Run along.
So again, nothing to do with you, Sheila. Run along. It's like you would talk to a child. It's incredibly patronising. He doesn't think for 1 minute that Sheila could contribute anything to the conversation. You know, he still wants to shelter her and not get her involved like he would a child. So again, victim of misogyny.
Just a minute, Miss Birling.
Look here, Inspector. I consider this uncalled for and officious. I've half a mind to report you. I've told you all I know. And now there isn't the slightest reason why my daughter should be dragged into this business.
What business? What's happening?
I'm a police inspector, Miss Birling. This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died in the infirmary after several hours of agony.
Oh, how horrible. Was it an accident?
So again, look at her reaction. Like Eric's, it is a reaction of empathy and sympathy. How horrible. Unlike Mr Birling's very dismissive, oh yes, horrid business. So her reaction, like Eric's, the younger generation's reaction, is far more empathetic and far more sympathetic.
No. She wanted to end her life. She felt she couldn't go on any longer.
Oh, don't tell me that's because I discharged her from my employment nearly 2 years ago.
That might have started it. Did you, Dad?
The girl had been causing trouble in the works. I was quite justified.
Yes, I think you were. I know we'd have done the same thing.
Again, interesting. Yet again, Gerald is agreeing with Mr Birling. Yes, I'd have done the same thing. So he is every bit the capitalist that Mr Birling is. Remember, Gerald, despite being of the same generation as Sheila and Eric, is an aristocrat. He is a member of the upper class. So you've got to think about how Gerald's character is symbolising, representing the whole of the aristocracy and the aristocracy's attitude here.
Don't look like that, Sheila.
Sorry, it's just I can't help thinking about this girl destroying herself so horribly. And I've been so happy tonight. I wish you hadn't told me.
Now, this is really significant because Sheila her gut reaction is to feel empathy and to feel really sad and upset. But she also says, I wish you hadn't told me. So at this stage in the play, she wants to be ignorant. She would rather not know and not be confronted with an uncomfortable truth about the society she lives in. Now, what will be interesting to the progression and the development of Sheila's character is how she becomes less and less ignorant as the play progresses from this point. But certainly when we first meet her, she is quite happy to stay in her ignorant little bubble that her parents have put her in.
What was she like? Quite young?
24.
Pretty?
She wasn't pretty when I saw her today.
Oh.
That's enough of that.
I don't really see that this inquiry gets you anywhere, Inspector. It's what happened to her since she left Mr. Birling's works that is important. And we can't help you there because we don't know.
Are you all sure you don't know?
Are you suggesting now that one of them knows something about this girl?
Yes.
You didn't come here just to see me, then?
No.
Well, of course, if I'd known that earlier, I wouldn't have called you officious and talked about reporting you. You understand that, don't you, Inspector?
Now, this is a really interesting or quite amusing moment because Mr. Birling suddenly regrets all the threatening, he did with, oh, I know your boss, I know Chief Constable Colonel Roberts, I play golf with him. He regrets behaving like that because now the inspector is hinting that other members of his family are involved. So suddenly we see a really huge power shift to the inspector here because despite being a lower status, he is omniscient. He knows all of this information that the Birling families don't, and that puts him in a position of power.
I thought that you were making the most of this tiny bit of information I could give you. You sure of your facts?
Some of them, yes.
I can't think they could be of any great consequence.
The girl's dead, though.
You talk as if we were responsible.
Just a minute, Sheila. Inspector, you and I had better go and talk this over quietly in a corner.
Why should you? He's finished with you. He says it's one of us now.
Well, I've never known an Eva Smith.
Neither have I.
Was that her name? Eva Smith?
Yes.
Never heard it before.
So, where are you now, Inspector?
Where I was before, Mr. Croft. I told you she'd used more than one name. She was still Eva Smith when Mr. Birling sacked her for wanting 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and 6. But after that, she stopped being Eva Smith. Perhaps she'd had enough of it.
Can't blame her.
Do you know what happened to this girl after she left my works?
Yes. She was out of work for the next 2 months. Both her parents were dead, so that she'd no home to go back to, and she hadn't been able to save much, so after 2 months, with no work, no money coming in, and living in lodgings, with no relatives to help her, few friends, lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate.
It's a rotten shame.
Well, there
Again, Sheila's gut reaction is empathy.
are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, Miss Birling. If there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. Ask your father.
Now that, again, is Priestley being very, very obviously socialist here. You may feel sympathy for Eva Smith, but realise that her fate, her situation is shared by millions of people across the country. And Mr. Birling knows all about it because these are the sorts of people that work in his factories for barely any money. So this is a very anti-capitalist, pro-socialist message. And look at Sheila's reaction.
But these girls aren't cheap labour. They're people.
That's probably even worth writing down, that quote. These girls aren't cheap labour. Excuse me, my voice. These girls aren't cheap labour. They're people. And that is, again, a socialist message. So Sheila, along with Eric, don't even realise that they have more empathy and more understanding and more sympathy with socialist ideas than they would think, even though they probably wouldn't even really know what that word meant. So Sheila's saying these people are human beings and deserve, you know, a certain level of life and respect. They're not just cheap labour.
I've had that notion myself from time to time. In fact, I thought it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women, counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms.
I expect it would. But what happened to her then?
For she had what seemed to her a wonderful stroke of luck. She was taken on in a shop. Millward's.
Millward's? It's a very good shop. We go there. In fact, I was there this afternoon.
There was a good deal of influenza about at the time, and Millward suddenly found themselves short-handed. She liked working there. It was a nice change from a factory. And she felt she was making a good fresh start. But after a couple of months, just when she felt she was settling down nicely, they told her she'd have to go.
Now, this is really important. So Sheila's next job after getting fired from the factory was working in Millward's, which is a posh department store, okay, a clothes shop. Now, imagine you're Eva Smith and you're a poor working class girl and you're used to working in places like factories. Imagine you're suddenly a shop assistant. How amazing and wonderful an opportunity would that be for a girl like Eva Smith? You know, to us, the idea of working in New Look or, you know, wherever doesn't exactly seem like a big deal. In fact, you'd think that's not a very good job, maybe. But actually, to someone like Eva Smith, working in a clothes shop would be almost like winning the lottery for her. It wouldn't typically be a job given to girls in her position, or very many girls in her position in her social class. But actually, because there was a lot of influenza, a lot of flu about, they found it hard to get employees. And so she was very, very lucky to get this job. But unfortunately, as the inspector said, she was then fired not long afterwards. And we're going to find out why.
Not doing her work properly.
There was nothing wrong with her work. A customer complained about her, and so she had to go.
When was this?
At the end of January last year.
What did this girl look like?
Well, I have a photograph of her, if you'd care to take a look at it there.
What's the matter with her?
She recognised her, didn't she?
So what we have there then is Sheila obviously recognising the photograph of the girl. Now, this is really important because it's very clear now that Sheila must have been involved in Eva Smith getting fired. And her reaction isn't to be defensive like her father. Her reaction is to burst into hysterical tears and run off stage. So we can see again her reaction to Mr Birling's, the different reaction to Mr Birling's is really, really obvious here. So how does her attitude appear to differ from her father's? And how could you use Sheila as a victim of misogyny here? Well, we talked a little bit about that as the clip was going. Sheila is far more sympathetic, far more empathetic, far more open-minded to these ideas, these almost socialist ideas that actually just because you're poor, just because you have a low status, doesn't mean that you deserve to be treated like nothing but cheap labour. We also see that her initial reaction to understanding that she played a part in Eva Smith's suicide is to hysterically cry, unlike Mr Birling, which is to say, oh, well, I just did what any man would, any employer would. And Sheila's a victim of misogyny, as she is very much, again, talked down to by her father. Oh, run along now, you know, you don't need to be involved. And the fact that Sheila has been kept very, very ignorant about society. So what I'd like you to do is write an explanation of how your impression of Sheila's character has developed since the start of the play. So think about Sheila at the start and then think about your impression of Sheila now. How has your opinion of her character developed? You might want to include how her views appear to be different from Mr Birling's, how she's a victim of misogyny, and why Priestley chooses to present her in this way. So I'm just going to help you a little bit with that final bullet point, so it's probably the most difficult. We know Priestley's intentions is to change our capitalist views to socialist views. He's not necessarily wanting to convert us to a 100% hardcore socialist state, but he does want to promote socialist ideas like social equality, getting rid of the class system, making the rich sympathetic to the poor, accepting that we all have a responsibility to take care of one another, and also to promote the rights of women. Think about how Sheila's more naturally socialist and empathetic attitude links into how Priestley wants us, the audience, to feel. He wants us to have the same sort of reaction as Sheila. Sheila in many ways is our model for how he wants us to behave, and you'll see that as we read more and more of the play and as her character develops further. But equally, he's promoting the rights of women as well. He's showing the evils and the dangers of misogyny and a patriarchal society. Okay, so you can pause the video and then just do your best to answer this question. Now, I know that it is difficult just listening to me ramble on in a PowerPoint and then being given these tasks that you are doing with no help and no support whatsoever. And you know, if you've been watching these videos and if you've been keeping up with this work, emailing into your teacher, you should feel really immensely proud of yourself. And believe me, when we go back, whenever that may be, you are going to really feel the benefit of having kept up and chipped away at these lessons. So I did just want to take this opportunity to say a really massive well done to you for, you know, persevering when you may not, you know, be able to turn around and ask for help if you're stuck. So with this and with any activity that I set in these PowerPoints, all we ask you to do is to try your best. If there are bits you don't understand, just leave them, because we will do all of this next year. Okay, when we're back, when you're in year 10, we will read this play as a class and we'll go over it together. Okay, so please don't worry if you find any of it difficult. Okay, so you can pause the video now and answer that question before we move on to our final slide. So our final feedback then. Do you think Eva is more of a victim of misogyny than Sheila is? Now, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It's simply generating your critical opinion. And patriarchal, what evidence do we have to know it was a patriarchal society in 1912? So well done, and I will see you in your next video.